Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us to thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally by thy mercy attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. I recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I ask leave for an extended introduction.
Ministers ask leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the Minister.
Mr. Speaker, to you and through you and all members of the Legislative Assembly, I would like to welcome 5 executive members of the Search and Rescue Sask Association of Volunteers who are in the Speaker's Gallery in the brightly coloured orange uniforms there. SARSAV is made up of member chapters of search and rescue professionals who volunteer their time for training, search missions, preventative information, and public awareness. With us today, we have, if you give us a wave when we introduce you, Bobby Buchanan, who is a primary care paramedic and is a SARSAV president based out of Porcupine Plain. We have Tracy Lagasse, who is a teacher at Ecole Gravelberg School, who is the SARSAV secretary based out of Wood River Search and Rescue. We have Anna Root, who is with the Canadian Armed Forces and is the SARSAV treasurer and is the Parkland Search and Rescue. Anna is originally from South Africa. We have Dustin Breers, who is the EH&S manager in EMW Industrial and Salt Coats. He is a SARSAV director out of Parkland, out of Yorkton. And we have Corporal George Riffle, who is with the RCMP out of the Yorkton-Melville area, and he is a SARSAV director out of the Parkland Search and Rescue Group. I would like all members to express their appreciation for the volunteer services of the SARSAV Group and welcome these members to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the official opposition, it's an honour to join with the Minister here today to welcome the volunteer search and rescue leadership that's here today, the Saskatchewan Association. Thank you so much for your presence here today. Thank you so much for your advocacy on behalf of that incredible network of volunteers across the province. And thank you for all that you do to support the incredible volunteerism of many to provide security and peace of mind to so many. As well as ensuring that critical response when minutes matter in the lives of people and communities across our province. So on behalf of the official opposition, thank you so very much, not only for being here, but for what you do day in, day out across the province.
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to join with the Minister of Government Relations and a member opposite in welcoming these SARSAV people to their Legislative Assembly. Anna Root, Corporal Jean Riffle, and of course Dustin Breers are from my constituency, so it's great to welcome constituents in the Assembly. A little story about Dustin, Mr. Speaker. Dustin is actually a private pilot as well. He's recently become involved in Canadian Air Civil Search and Rescue Association, group I'm involved with. He was my spotter about a week and a half ago, and I've never seen a spotter find a target that quickly, Mr. Speaker. So just like all members, to welcome these valuable members to their Legislative Assembly.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I noticed that today we're joined by people from the Sikh community and leadership from the Sikh Society here in Regina, including some of the younger members of the community. Happy to see them here with us today and thank them for all of the work that they do to strengthen our community, and looking forward to joining for the Nagar Kirtan Parade in a few weeks. I'd like to thank all the members for, ask all the members to join me in welcoming them to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce many leaders in the West Gallery in the Sikh community, not just here in Regina, but right across Saskatchewan, that have joined us here this afternoon. We had a flag raising just earlier, and our government has also designated April as Sikh Heritage Month, and these folks are here to commemorate that, and we're very proud to do that. We all know, Mr. Speaker, the Sikh community has a rich history in Saskatchewan, and this month will be a time to reflect on those traditions, core values, and honor the diverse and inclusive culture within our province. Sikh Heritage Month will be a great opportunity to remember, celebrate, and educate future generations in our province about Sikh Canadians and the significant role they've played and continue to play in our community. That community has been integral in moving Saskatchewan forward and has made a tremendous impact to the growth of our province over the past decade. The government's proud of the growing diversity in Saskatchewan and recognize the important contributions from all those different cultures. So, Mr. Speaker, I please ask all members to welcome this contingent here this afternoon and thank them for all their contributions.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join the Minister and, of course, the Leader in my role as Secretary for Culture and Heritage in this province to welcome the Sikh community here. It's a pleasure to have you in your legislature, and congratulations on the flag raising. We look forward to this month and the events ahead. Welcome and congratulations for today. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Regina Pasqua.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to join Minister and welcome all this Saskatchewan Sikh community. There is a President Bill Singh, he is Regina Sikh Community President, and Ram Singh, he is Granthi, and Ved Darshan Singh as well. And Lovely and Sandeep Sidhu, they are organizer of Baba Guru Nanak Kitchen. They provide free food. And there's one of my constituents, Jatinder Brar, with his son Mahtab Brar. I ask all, and Khushminder Sidhu as well. I would like to ask all the members to join me, welcome all these fellows in their Legislative Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Westview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, I'd also like to welcome the Sikh folk from Saskatoon and Regina and all across Saskatoon to their legislature. It's a pleasure and a welcome to have you here, and I would assume you're some of the 108,000 that we've been fortunate enough to attract to our province, and I welcome you all here, and I ask all members to join with me in welcoming them. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Regina Wall Shakers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to you and through you to all members of the Assembly. I'd like to welcome 40 kids from McColl St. Mary in the beautiful constituency of Regina Wall Shakers. They're accompanied by their teacher, Ryan LeBlanc, and I think Carol Omas is up there somewhere. But I'm looking forward to speaking with them after the Assembly, and I ask all of my colleagues to be on their best behavior to show the kids of McColl St. Mary how well we can be behaved in the Legislative Assembly. So welcome to your Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Saskatchewan Rivers.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, seated in the Speaker's Gallery, is my much younger sister, Pamela Helbig Suket. There's 3 of us girls, and she's the younger one, and of course I'm the middle daughter. So she's a business owner in Prince Albert, and please welcome her, everyone give a warm welcome to my sister, to her Legislative Assembly. Hear, hear.
Presenting petitions. Recognize the member for Cypress Hills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition from the citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a soul-sucking carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action: to cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the citizens of Maymont, Battleford, and Meota. I do present.
As a member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again today to present petitions on behalf of concerned people, citizens, local businesses all across the province as it relates to the imposition of the PST onto construction labor by that Sask Party government. They've highlighted that this is the epitome of a job-killing tax, Mr. Speaker, and sadly, we've seen that reality play out, Mr. Speaker. We've seen permits down across the province, thousands of jobs that have been lost, hard-working Saskatchewan people that are committed to building and bettering the province that they know and love that have been forced to move from our province, Mr. Speaker, when they've been facing job loss in the construction sector. And we know that this has been made so much worse economically by the imposition of the PST onto construction labour. An imposition as well that's hit households hard. We know that households now are paying $800 more in PST than they were just 4 years ago. That's a 70% increase, Mr. Speaker, and has, certainly creates hardship for households and people, but a lot of hurt for our economy, Mr. Speaker. The prayer reads as follows. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to stop saddling families and businesses with the costs of their mismanagement and immediately reinstate the PST exemption on construction and stop hurting Saskatchewan businesses and families. These petitions are signed by concerned residents of Saskatoon. I so submit.
Recognized the member for Saskatoon, Newtana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today to present a petition on the Regina bypass project and for better transparency. Mr. Speaker, the people who signed this petition would like to bring to our attention the following. Very few details about the Regina bypass project are publicly available, despite it being the costliest infrastructure project funded by taxpayers in the province's history. Ministry officials identified and documented major deficiencies in the project that were in an email that have yet to be released in full for public review. In the Assembly, the previous Minister of Highways referenced the breach of an aquifer in Wascana Creek as an example of one of these major deficiencies. However, our current Minister of Highways has repeatedly stated on the record that, quote, there are no major deficiencies on this bypass, end quote. Saskatchewan people are going to be paying for this expensive piece of infrastructure for the next 30 years. And Mr. Speaker, in the interest of the Saskatchewan people, all this is asking for is government transparency. So it's a really straightforward petition. I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to immediately release a full, unredacted copy of records detailing all minor and major deficiencies identified in the Regina bypass project to date. And Mr. Speaker, the people who have signed this petition today are from Moose Jaw and my hometown of La Flèche. I so submit.
Here, here.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to get big money out of Saskatchewan politics, and the undersigned residents of the province of Saskatchewan want to bring to our attention the following: that Saskatchewan's outdated Election Act allows corporations, unions, and individuals, even those outside this province, to make unlimited donations to our province's political parties. You know, Mr. Speaker, that the people of Saskatchewan deserve to live in a fair province where all voices are equal and money can't influence politics. But over the past 10 years, the Sask Party has received $12.61 million in corporate donations, and of that, $2.87 million came from companies outside Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan politics should belong to Saskatchewan people, and we know that the federal government and the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and now British Columbia have moved to limit this influence and level the playing field by banning corporate and union donations to political parties. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to overhaul Saskatchewan's campaign finance laws, to end out-of-province donations, to put a ban on donations from corporations and unions, and to put a donation limit on individual donations. And Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition come from the city of Moose Jaw. I do so present. Thank you.
And as a member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition calling for critical supports for survivors of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, the individuals who signed this petition wish to bring to our attention the following. Saskatchewan has the highest rates of domestic violence amongst all of the provinces in Canada, and employees who are survivors of domestic violence should be able to take a leave of absence from their employment without penalty, and Saskatchewan must do much more to protect survivors of domestic violence. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Legislative Assembly to pass legislation providing critical supports for survivors of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, the individuals signing this petition today come from Saskatoon. I do so present.
Here, here. Recognize the member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present a petition on seed regulations. The petitioners wish to bring to our attention that the federal government is proposing to pass regulations that would enable plant breeders to charge farmers royalties on crops which they have grown. One of the proposals under consideration by the federal government will see farmers pay an endpoint royalty on every ton of crops sold, while another proposal will see farmers pay a trailing royalty on every ton of crop that they have grown and used for seed in later years. The current proposals under consideration do not give farmers any guarantee that any royalties will be devoted to funding research, nor do they provide any guarantee that research would return the value of the research to farmers, nor do they provide any guarantee that the research would be on Canadian crop varieties. The current proposals will give plant breeders total control over plant varieties registered after February 2015, and the current model of government and farmer-funded research has generated up to 20 times returns for the Canadian public and for farmers. The petitioners, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Saskatchewan Party government to advocate on behalf of farmers with the federal government to ensure that the rights of farmers to freely use their own seed be established and maintained, that endpoint royalties and trailing royalties will not be imposed on farmers, and that any seed research that is paid by farmers will be controlled and directed by farmers. Mr. Speaker, the people who have signed this petition are from Swift Current and Assiniboia. I do present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This weekend, Saskatchewan came together to remember on the one-year anniversary of the tragic Humboldt Broncos bus crash. I attended the ceremony on Saturday, April 6th, along with the member from Saskatoon Fairview, the Premier, the member for Humboldt, and thousands of others. Together, we honored the 16 lives, the 13 survivors, and many more whose lives were forever changed by this terrible accident. In the aftermath of this tragedy, we saw the best of Humboldt, the best of Saskatchewan, and the best of Canada, and the outpouring of support for the families, the victims, and for the community. The speakers at the ceremony brought words of comfort, remembrance, encouragement, and hope. An important way to honor the memory of the 16 individuals is to honor the wishes of the family of Logan Boulay, who have stepped forward to advocate for organ donation registration as a part of Logan's legacy. This has and will have an incredible impact on those who will benefit from the increased awareness and participation in the organ donation process into the future. I ask that all members join me in expressing our sorrow, solidarity, and commemoration with the families and the community of Humboldt. We stand with them, and we continue to stand with them.
I recognize the member from Humboldt.
Tragedy and triumph. Those are words so often used when describing the devastating accident with the Humboldt Broncos that happened 1 year ago on April 6th. They're fitting words because it's a story of both. So often a crisis brings out both the best and the worst of people, but not so with the tragic Broncos accident. We saw only the best of people in Humboldt, in our province, and around the world. So many ordinary people doing extraordinary acts to assist and to reach out in any way they could. The Premier and I and other colleagues had the honour of attending the memorial service held on Saturday. It was a beautiful service that brought together so many to reflect on both the tragedy and the triumph. To the families of those lost, we continue to pray for you. To the first responders and medical staff, we thank you so very much for your service. To the billet families, we extend our hearts to you. And to our Broncos players who continue to heal, your strength is an inspiration to us all, and we are thinking of you. Though our hearts still ache, we will heal. We are all Humboldt strong.
I recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, this week is National Volunteer Week in Canada, an opportunity to recognize the work of volunteers across our nation and here in Saskatchewan. Volunteers in our communities coach teams, deliver meals, build homes, host events, and contribute their time to improve people's lives. The spirit of volunteerism in our province is strong. We have a reputation at home and abroad for the incredible work of volunteers working to strengthen our communities. The capacity of our community organizations to support, train, and coordinate volunteering in our community is something to be commended and valued. In particular, I'd like to commend the incredible work of Saskatchewan's volunteer firefighters, medical first responders, and search and rescue volunteers who make incredible sacrifices to keep others safe. I'd also like to thank the numerous search and rescue volunteers who have reached out to many of us to remind us of the importance of their volunteerism in the province and to request their inclusion in the new tax credit for volunteer first responders. I was proud to write the Finance Minister to call for just that. Their work in those crucial hours when Saskatchewan people are in need cannot be underestimated. Mr. Speaker, volunteering is the backbone of this province, and the generosity of the people of Saskatchewan in contributing their time and experience to their communities enriches our province as a whole. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Lloyd Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to rise today and announce that the latest Statistics Canada report shows that Saskatchewan is now in its 8th month of consecutive job growth. March's unemployment was the lowest recorded in Saskatchewan since August 2015. Our year-over-year employment has increased by 9,800 jobs. Saskatchewan had record high levels of labour force, employment, full-time employment, and male and female employment for the month of March. Also, major year-over-year gains were reported for agriculture, up 3,400, educational services were up 2,400, and healthcare and social services were up 2,400. Youth employment is up 3,000 jobs for 7 consecutive months of year-over-year increases, and the seasonally adjusted youth employment rate was the 2nd lowest in the country. Mr. Speaker, what is disheartening is the lack of support that we see from the members opposite. We know that if they were to take government, all of this success and progress would be hindered, as they support the job-killing Trudeau carbon tax, and their leader would send our province into crippling debt with his $2.5 billion spending sprees.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker, with over 9,000 new jobs in the province, the people of Saskatchewan can look forward to more opportunities for their families and communities. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Meadow Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in the House today to talk about our government's commitment to expanding health care for Saskatchewan people. The 2019-20 budget included $12 million to begin construction of a new long-term care facility in my hometown of Meadow Lake, as well as $700,000 to support the creation of a new satellite dialysis service in our community. With construction starting in the spring of 2020, the new long-term care facility will replace the current facility in Meadow Lake and will increase capacity from 55 to 72 beds. The funding for the creation of a new dialysis service is intended to support increased capacity for in-centre hemodialysis services and to enhance kidney wellness services in northern Saskatchewan. These new services will provide our healthcare professionals the ability to deliver a higher level of patient care and allows patients to receive life-saving treatment closer to home. Mr. Speaker, as a representative of the Meadow Lake constituency, I'm proud that this will give residents in the north improved access to needed services. These critical investments in healthcare further demonstrate that our government's budget is delivering the right balance for the people of Saskatchewan.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Westview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to welcome the Sikh Society of Saskatchewan to their legislature today as they celebrate the 550th anniversary of Guru Nanak Dev Ji's birth and the beginning of the development of the Sikh religion. I am also pleased to announce that April 2019 has been proclaimed Sikh Heritage Month. Mr. Speaker, the Sikh Society of Saskatchewan will be celebrating the contributions and aspirations of all Sikh Canadians. It also creates awareness and appreciation for the Sikhs in Canada by helping the surrounding community to develop a greater understanding and appreciation of the rich, unique, and diverse heritage of the Sikh community. Mr. Speaker, Sikhism is a world religion with over 35 million followers worldwide and roughly 468,000 followers in Canada. Its message is to keep God in heart and mind at all times, live honestly and work hard, treat everyone equally, be generous to the less fortunate, and serve others. This month's celebrations are a great way to learn firsthand how the Sikh society works to promote equality and harmony for all. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members of this Assembly to welcome the Sikh Society of Saskatchewan as they celebrate the 550th anniversary of Guru Nanak Dev Ji's birth and the beginning of the development of the Sikh religion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Swift Current.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday, the largest truck convoy ever organized anywhere in the world converged on Regina to stand up for our energy industry, to stand up for our agriculture industry, to say no to Trudeau's anti-pipeline and anti-tanker bills, to say no to the Trudeau carbon tax, and to stand up for Saskatchewan. That's what the rally was about, Mr. Speaker, and it was a great rally. Yet, even now that the rally is over, the NDP leader continues to repeat his bizarre allegations that the rally was about spreading hatred against minorities. He doubled down on this smear in Saturday's Leader Post, where he accused a number of the organizers of, quote, spreading hate against newcomers and religious minorities. Mr. Speaker, it's just bizarre how far the Leader of the Opposition is willing to go to discredit and smear the hardworking Saskatchewan men and women who just want to voice their opposition to the Trudeau carbon tax. On Friday, one of the organizers called the NDP leader's claims about the organizers 100% false. He said the NDP leader's attacks on rally organizer Jason LeBlanc were sickening, and he called on the NDP leader to apologize to Mr. LeBlanc. Mr. Speaker, is the NDP leader actually capable of admitting that he was wrong, and is he going to apologize for his smears against the rally and its organizers? We're about to find out.
Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's such a pleasure to be here in the legislature today for question period and to be joined by so many people from the Sikh community, including so many young children. It's great to see those young people who will be part of our future, Mr. Speaker. And you know, education is so important for that next generation. Every dollar we fail to invest in education, we'll wind up spending down the road $5 instead on poverty, on illness, on crime, things that are on the rise here in the Sask Party's Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, and we see that reflected in this year's budget. Since 2016, we've seen an increase of 4% in health costs, of 9% in corrections and policing costs, and an increase of 18% in social services expenses, a clear indication that poverty is on the rise here in the province, Mr. Speaker. In the same time, in that same period of time, education funding in K-12, no increase whatsoever. Despite there being 7,000 more children, many children coming from English as a second language, or children with special needs who aren't getting the extra help they deserve. In that same time, we've seen funding for advanced education go down by 4%. Mr. Speaker, my question is, why is this Premier making the choices he is, choices today that will cost us tomorrow?
I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, with all due respect to the Leader of the Opposition, nothing could be farther from the truth, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is this year's education investment, in our next generation in this province, Mr. Speaker, is the largest in the history of the province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that investment is going directly into our classrooms. We saw an increase mid-year last year of $30 million directly into our classrooms. Further, $26 million this year, Mr. Speaker, going into our education system across the province, Mr. Speaker. And the Leader of the Opposition raised English as an additional language, Mr. Speaker. One of the schools that I serve as an MLA in the community of Rosthern, Mr. Speaker, I believe it is the highest, has the highest level of English as an additional language students in the school division, that particular school division, Mr. Speaker. And the fact of the matter is, as the Minister of Education was out in that community just a week or two ago, is they're getting a new facility, Mr. Speaker. They're getting a new and larger integrated facility to ensure it serves all of the members in that community, Mr. Speaker, along with the investments that have come directly in the classroom, Mr. Speaker. This is an education budget, an investment in our future and our next generation that the people of this province can be so proud of.
Hear, hear. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Per student funding, I should say, has been falling for years and years, Mr. Speaker, and this government has failed to invest as it should in children in this province, not to mention those children who are struggling more. Children today who are living in poverty. What kind of a future will we have, Mr. Speaker, when there's so many children who are going to school hungry, so many kids who don't have a safe place to go home to? Over half of the people accessing food bank in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, are children, the highest such percentage in the country, and 1 in 4 children in this province are living in poverty, Mr. Speaker. When will this government recognize those are crisis levels, and we need a response that is proportional to the level of that crisis? When will this government take this seriously and improve the lives of Saskatchewan children?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. Mr. Speaker, we have been working on poverty. We have reduced the poverty rates from when we had the privilege of forming government in 2007 from over 20%, something that we inherited from the opposition, down to in and around 10%, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, the investments that the Leader of the Opposition touched on, I see these as investments in social services, Mr. Speaker. We were able to increase our budget by $55.5 million. If the member opposite has some idea of where we should cut our funding, Mr. Speaker, I'd ask him to put that on the legislative floor as to where we should cut our funding, who we should cut our funding with, and how long we should cut that funding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister knows well that those numbers have increased because utilization has increased, because poverty has increased. And that is a direct result of choices made by this government, choices that have resulted in 25% of kids living in this poverty. Where is the action proportional to that crisis level of child poverty in our province?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thanks again, Mr. Speaker. I'm wondering if the Leader of the Opposition thought it was a crisis from 2000 to 2007 when the food bank numbers went up by double, Mr. Speaker, went from 12,000 to over 25,000, Mr. Speaker. And those numbers have remained fairly steady, Mr. Speaker. In saying that, our population has also increased by 150,000 people, Mr. Speaker. So proportionately, our numbers are lower. When he referenced the last week about the poverty numbers going up in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, he was also referencing in 2016, and I know he wasn't a member of the Assembly then, Mr. Speaker, but we were certainly facing some tough economic times and some tough economic headwinds in 2016, Mr. Speaker. So we have continued year after year to invest in our social programs, in our education, and within health. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Disappointing to hear no real response to the high levels of child poverty, no plan to make any changes to address that 1 in 4 kids in this province live in poverty today. That is a crisis level number, Mr. Speaker, but we don't see the kind of response that we should from this government. We should also, Mr. Speaker, be paying close attention to the number of children who are in care today. We hear from this government that there are 5,000 children in care. 80% of those children are First Nations and Métis. My question for the Minister today is, does that include all of the children in care, all types of placement, including both permanent and temporary wards? I'd like to have some clarity on those numbers.
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just for clarification for the House, we do have 2,846 children that were in the care of the ministry as of 2013, Mr. Speaker. As of 2018, we've got 3,199. That is an increase of 353 children, Mr. Speaker. This is something that we're trying to deal with very quickly, Mr. Speaker. It has been a very difficult time to be able to get
to these children to be able to make sure that these children have some options to be able to get out of poverty, Mr. Speaker. Within the First Nation community, I know that the member opposite wasn't able to attend, but we did just sign a recent agreement with Saskatoon Tribal Council where we have not 17 but now 18 First Nations delivering the child and family services, Mr. Speaker, and he's very critical of what social services is doing with the treatment and the care of Indigenous children, Mr. Speaker, but I haven't heard him say anything about those 18 First Nation communities that are delivering the service on behalf of the people of Saskatchewan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
We know that the government didn't cost the carbon tax in their budget. And in committee last week, the minister told me that his government also has no plan to deal with the impact of the carbon tax on school divisions. Wow. The SSBA has said that the impact could be $8 million. While the minister has been eager to whip out these stats and making partisan attacks, he admitted that he hasn't done any work in estimating or developing a plan to help school divisions with the costs. Instead, they're hanging their hat on winning the carbon tax reference case, which could be years away. Mr. Speaker, as the former finance minister used to say, hope is not a plan. To the minister, what happens if you lose, and what's the plan for our schools in the meantime?
I recognize the Minister of Education.
Speaker, Mr. Speaker, in estimates last week, Mr. Speaker, the member talked to me about exemptions, Mr. Speaker, but never once have they stood up and said and joined the government, Mr. Speaker, in seeking for an exemption for the entire province from the carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. And that's objectionable, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are, as we understand, some conversations going on, Mr. Speaker, in terms of whether there's going to be exemptions for agriculture or for education, Mr. Speaker, for small business and other sectors of the economy, Mr. Speaker. Those are interesting conversations, Mr. Speaker, and we want to make sure that we get as many details of those as possible. But, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, the carbon tax is potentially going to cost school divisions a significant amount of money, Mr. Speaker. That's a bridge we're going to have to cross when we fully appreciate the full impact of the carbon tax on the education sector, Mr. Speaker. But we're going to continue to keep a very close eye on this, Mr. Speaker. It's going to have an impact. It's going to have an impact on the classroom, Mr. Speaker, and we're very concerned about that.
That's right. Here, here. Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, the minister knows full well that those costs are accumulating as we speak. The minister says it's too early to be determining what the exact cost to the sector will be. Certainly the impact on gas and power and fuel is something that can be and has been estimated by the SSBA. What is more concerning is that the minister says they haven't even reached out to the federal government for more information on the rebates for schools and haven't had or scheduled any meetings to flesh out a Plan B. Our schools are already in make-do-with-less mode. Can the minister provide a guarantee that if this tax is imposed across the education sector, that the government will ensure that school divisions will be made whole as they adapt?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Speaker, it's very rich of the member opposite to defend the sector on the carbon tax when those people on that side of the House, Mr. Speaker, won't defend the province of Saskatchewan against the same tax, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, we know that the tax is going to be ineffective, Mr. Speaker, but what we do know, Mr. Speaker, is that the Minister of Finance, that there has been some outreach, Mr. Speaker. We don't know what the impact of any exemptions are going to be. We're going to continue to follow that very, very closely, Mr. Speaker. But again, we're very, very concerned about the impact of the carbon tax on this sector, as we are in respect of the impact of the carbon tax on the entire economy, Mr. Speaker. We know it's going to be devastating to our entire economy, Mr. Speaker, but we're going to continue to keep a very close eye on this. The impact in the classroom, Mr. Speaker, is very, very important to us, and that's why we continue to have conversations about how we're going to deal with this matter, Mr. Speaker, as well as many other matters in terms of how we deliver education in Saskatchewan.
As a member for Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, he is the Minister of Education, and I wish he would spend nearly as much time on actually devising a plan for school divisions as he does on spin. Hear, hear. After all of his conversations, surely the minister has some understanding of exactly how cash-strapped school divisions are. How can it be that this government has no Plan B for an additional $8 million in costs? The feds have signaled that there will be nearly $500 million over the next 5 years to help schools and hospitals defray additional costs. Will the minister make sure that the fuel surcharge proceeds fully offset the cost to the education sector, and will he guarantee, Mr. Speaker, that school divisions will get their fair share of the rebates, unlike what happened with WCB rebates in 2016?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
So one thing I can assure the House, Mr. Speaker, is that we want to make sure that any impacts with respect to the carbon tax, Mr. Speaker, don't adversely affect the education sector, Mr. Speaker. There's talks of rebates, Mr. Speaker. There's talks of exemptions, Mr. Speaker. These are all conversations which we have to monitor very, very carefully, Mr. Speaker, because we understand that the impacts, Mr. Speaker, will be felt in the classroom, Mr. Speaker. But I want to remind the House, Mr. Speaker, that this is the largest operating budget for the education sector, Mr. Speaker, in the history of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. We continue to pay very, very close attention, Mr. Speaker, to the impacts on the classroom, Mr. Speaker, as we continue to have some discussions, Mr. Speaker. And as I've mentioned in this House before, this is exactly why we've moving forward with an innovation agenda, Mr. Speaker, in education, so that we can not only ensure proper delivery of education, Mr. Speaker, but protect kids in the classroom, Mr. Speaker. I've heard the member opposite, and I've heard her leader say it's not about money. It's about results, Mr. Speaker, and I couldn't agree more.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, failing to plan is planning to fail. You see that here today. When the Sask Party brought in the $1 billion PST hike, they failed to consider the damage it would cause to our economy, and nowhere is that more obvious than in the construction industry. Mr. Speaker, figures that were just released today by Stats Canada show that the value of permits in Saskatchewan are down 19% year over year, actually 34% month over month, as well as the residential industry down 32% year over year. What's it going to take for this Sask Party government to realize that the PST that they foisted on construction is hurting this vital industry, and will they finally do the right thing and reverse this damaging decision?
Recognize the Minister of Trade.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. His entire argument is undermined by that same report, Mr. Speaker. The province in last place, as far as building permits are concerned, is Alberta. Mr. Speaker, where there is no PST at all. So his entire assertion is undermined by that fact alone. Another Statistics Canada report, though, Mr. Speaker, that I would point to from Friday, the labour market survey, which I note that they had nothing to say about. The 8th consecutive month of year-over-year job growth, Mr. Speaker, nearly 4,000 jobs created in the last month alone, 10,000 jobs created over the course of the last year, one of the lowest unemployment rates in the entire country, Mr. Speaker. Despite headwinds, our economy continues to move forward. Our job creators continue to create opportunity and create jobs for our young people here in this province.
I recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, the minister can boast and brag and spin how he chooses and try to pat himself on the back, but the facts of the matter are, in the construction sector, and the facts are this, shown in the report on Friday, is that we've lost 1,400 jobs, Mr. Speaker, and the minister can paint a different reality. But we know this government saw a slowing economy and slammed on the brakes, making things worse with the application of the PST. Stats Canada's numbers show that the value of permits for single-family homes in Saskatchewan has been on a downward trend since 2013, and then, of course, going to a record low in the last 10 years, Mr. Speaker, with the imposition of the PST. We've lost 1,400 jobs in the construction industry this year, many in the year before that. Just how much worse does it have to get, and what else does the Sask Party have to hear before they do the right thing and reverse their decision to slam the construction industry with the PST?
Recognize the Minister of Trade.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just reiterate, the entire premise of his question is undermined by the fact that Alberta had the 10th position in terms of building permits over the course of the last year, where there's no PST, Mr. Speaker. And I noticed he didn't address that in the follow-on question. And the member wants to talk about the economy, Mr. Speaker. From what I've gathered on their side of the House, they have two policies on the economy. They want to impose a massive carbon tax on the province. And let there be no doubt, Mr. Speaker, if they were to form government, the first thing they would do, like Rachel Notley, is impose a carbon tax on this province, something opposed by nearly 90% of the population of Saskatchewan. Their other position, Mr. Speaker, of which that member voted for, is to oppose pipelines. They opposed the Northern Gateway pipeline, Mr. Speaker, which would have been massively beneficial for our energy sector in this province. They have opposed trade agreements repeatedly, Mr. Speaker. The things that make our economy move, the things that create jobs and opportunity, they have said no to every step of the way.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 13 times the Information and Privacy Commissioner found that the village of Pine House failed to follow the law before this government finally decided to investigate. We know from coverage of the resulting report, which has been leaked to the media, that the inspection found extremely serious violations and that not all of the report's recommendations have been implemented. The people of Pine House deserve to know what was found, especially given the connections between the Sask Party, some of the Sask Party ministers and some of the village council. Will the minister commit today to releasing the report that prompted the current inquiry, and will he be implementing all the report's recommendations?
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I believe everyone is well aware that we had an initial inspection done in the village of Pine House. In that inspection, we found that there was some further answers that we had, some questions that we needed to have a deeper dive on. So therefore, we asked our initial inspector to do an inquiry. And in that inquiry now, we have asked for some specific questions to be asked and some more, another report to be provided to us. And what we've indicated is that both the inspection and the inquiry will not be released until we have had it in our hands and been able to have a complete review and determine what our next actions are. And then once those actions are committed, we will release both those reports.
Good. I recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Information and Privacy Commissioner wrote to the Minister of Government Relations in August of 2016 regarding Pine House Village. The Commissioner asked the Ministry to intervene and provide assistance to the village in light of its repeated and ongoing refusal to comply with FOI requests or respond to the Commissioner's letters. Wow. 2 months later, in October 2016, the then Minister for Government Relations indicated that her officials would be setting up meetings with the village, yet the obstruction continued. Wow. And serious pressure for the village to comply with financial and freedom of information laws didn't really accelerate until we began asking about this matter late last year. Why did it take so long for this government to take seriously the concerns of the people of Pine House?
Good question.
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Mr. Speaker, we always work with our municipalities that are out of compliance to help them get back into compliance. SUMA, SARM, all our stakeholder groups are always working with municipalities that struggle with compliance. Quite often we found that many of these municipalities struggle with capacity, as we've quite often heard from even those representatives from the north that talk about their communities not having the capacity to deal with that. On November 19th, we received a report from the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner that had made it clear that from his report and his initial indications were that the mayor of the village was not interested in compliance, so therefore we initiated an initial inspection. That inspection has been completed. We've now asked the inspector to do an inquiry. That inquiry is in progress right now.
Kathy, get up
once
on your
those
feet
are
if you've got
completed,
something to
we'll
say.
be able to release those to the public.
Here, here.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, we were encouraged to learn last week that the Finance Minister has recused herself from discussions involving Pine House. This was the right thing to do, and we applaud her for doing that. Unfortunately, the time to do it would have been in August 2016, when three things happened. One, the Information Privacy Commissioner wrote to the Ministry of Government Relations asking the ministry to intervene. Two, the minister took an all-expense-paid fishing trip to Pine House. And three, the minister moved from social services to government relations, where she became directly responsible for overseeing the inspection the commissioner had requested. Why did the now Finance Minister not recuse herself from this matter in 2016 when she should have?
Hear, hear. Good question.
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance has repaid any of the fees that were charged for accommodation that were provided by the community. She also asked for a ruling from the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, who has found that there was no wrongdoing in this. We have continued to have an inspection now into the community. We have now furthered that into an inquiry, and we are now anxiously awaiting that final report, Mr. Speaker.
As a member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Sask Party once again used their majority to shut down our call for answers on the GTH land deals. Every member of the Sask Party voted against the judicial inquiry. Saskatchewan people deserve so much better when it comes to transparency, and they deserve a serious plan to get us out of this GTH mess. Now, in January, they announced they were hiring a third-party consultant to lead the transition to a new model. Last week, we've learned they plan to allow a private firm to run the GTH operations and make the government an absentee property owner. Is this the new model that the third-party consultant came up with, and will you make that report public, or will the minister make that report public? When will we see the full plan to reverse the financial bloodshed at the GTH?
Hear, hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to answer the question. The answer quite simply is governments do not belong in the property business on a long-term basis. The project has been started, it's been established, and now it's time for the private sector to step forward, come up, and to take over the operations of the GTH, and also to take responsibility for the marketing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we want to look after the taxpayers' dollars as well and as effectively as we can, and part of that is to have people working on a commission rather than on a salary. And Mr. Speaker, as we go forward, we look for continuing success at the GTH from the people that are already there, and we are optimistic and hopeful that we're able to find buyers and occupiers of the property and use it for what it's intended, Mr. Speaker.
Here, here, here. Why is the member from? Why is the member on her feet?
Order, Mr. Speaker.
What's your point of? Recognize the Premier.
During question period, I used language that was unparliamentary, and I would like to withdraw and apologize.
Why is the member on her feet?
With leave to introduce a guest, Mr. Speaker.
There's requested leave for introduction of guests. Leave granted. Recognize the member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During question period, we had a friend of, I think, both sides of this chamber join us this afternoon. Seated behind us is the Honourable Mr. Harry Van Mulligan, former MLA for Regina Douglas Park, in a few different names, I think, in forms that it has had in its past. He was MLA back from 1986 to 2009, served many very distinguished portfolios in his career, some of them notably the Minister of Finance, Minister of Government Relations, and the Minister of Social Services. And he's a former MLA who's still very active, and I'm very lucky to have him as a very active member of Regina Douglas Park. He often volunteers still at events and is loved by many in the community. It's a pleasure to have him here this afternoon. I ask all members to join me in welcoming Mr. Harry Van Mulligan to his Legislative Assembly.
Hear, hear.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Leave to introduce the guest, Mr. Speaker.
Minister's asked leave to join in the introductions. Leave granted. Recognize the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the member opposite in welcoming Mr. Van Mulligan back to the Assembly. I remember him well when he was in government, and was a person of exceptional candor with regard to his dealings in the House and his dealings outside. I remember one time he was preparing a budget, and the media asked him what was in it, and he said, "Oh, not much." Well, the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, there's always a lot in a budget, but I've always respected and admired his candor and his sense of humor, and would ask members to welcome him.
I recognize the member for, why is the member for Cannington on his feet?
To introduce a guest with leave.
Members asked leave to join in the introduction. Leave granted. Recognize the member for Cannington.
I'd like to join with the other members in welcoming Harry Van Mulligan to the House. Harry actually just lives down the street from my place. He, as finance minister, took money out of all of our pockets, and he still does that to me by showing up at my door every year for the Heart and Stroke Fund, which I gladly contribute to. Although I wish he would do more of that work and less with the members opposite, but I would like to ask everyone to welcome him to his assembly.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills.
One, the Honourable Ms. Harpar.
I recognize the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 171, Income Tax Amendment Act 2019, be now introduced and read a first time.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 171 be now read and introduced the first time. Pleasure to the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister.
Next sitting of the Assembly, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Why is the Government House Leader on his feet?
With leave to move a motion dealing with committees.
And House Leaders requested leave to move a motion regarding committees. I think it's withdrawal of a bill. Is leave granted? Leave has been granted. Government House Leader may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 139, the Foreign Worker Recruitment and Immigration Services Amendment Act 2018, be withdrawn from the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice and committed to the Standing Committee on Human Services.
The Government House Leader has moved that Bill number 139, the Foreign Worker Recruitment and Immigration Services Amendment Act 2018, be withdrawn from the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice and committed to the Standing Committee on Human Services. Is the Assembly ready for the question? It's a pleasure, Assembly, to adopt the motion. Motion is carried. Orders of the day.
Written questions. Question number 73, asked by Ms. Moen.
I recognize the Government Whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to order the answers to questions 73 through 74.
Ordered 73 through 74.
Thanks for being here today, guys. Government orders, second readings. Item number 1. Bill number 168, the Justices of the Peace Amendment Act 2019. The Honourable Mr. Morgan.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to move second reading of the Justice of the Peace Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Speaker, this Act will implement some of the advisory recommendations of the 2018 Justices of the Peace Commission and make other improvements. Every 6 years, as part of an independent remuneration process, a commission is required to prepare and submit a report with respect to the determination of salary and benefits for Justices of the Peace. Mr. Speaker, the most recent commission report was submitted in December 2018. One of the recommendations in the report was the extension of the Public Employees Pension Plan to the additional Justices of the Peace. Currently, only senior Justices of the Peace are enrolled in this pension plan. These amendments will extend the pension plan to, open quote, non-senior Justices of the Peace as well. Mr. Speaker, the amendments will also add a new section to the Act to provide that the salary, pension and benefit amounts payable to JPs are, open quote, a charge on the General Revenue Fund. The Provincial Court Act 1998 already contains a similar provision respecting provincial court judges' compensation. This section will provide further support for the judicial independence of Justices of the Peace. Mr. Speaker, this Act also includes a transitional section to confirm the pension payments that we made under the regulations in the interim period from April 1 to when these Act amendments come into force. Existing regulatory authority will be used to provide pension payments to the additional Justices of the Peace during this interim period. Mr. Speaker, the amendments will also repeal an outdated provision that would authorize the removal of a JP for failure to file a return. This section is not currently being applied, and the complaint process in the Act is the more appropriate remedy. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I'm not crossing the floor. Finally, Mr. Speaker, there are some housekeeping amendments to correct cross-references and to clarify the regulation-making power respecting the benefits of Justices of the Peace. Mr. Speaker, these Act changes will complete the 2018 Justices of the Peace Commission process. The Saskatchewan Justices of the Peace Association is aware of the pension provisions in this bill and is supportive of the changes. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to move second reading of the Justices of the Peace Amendment Act 2019.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 168 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'm pleased to give the initial comments from the official opposition as it pertains to Bill number 168, the Justice of the Peace Administration Act 2019. And Mr. Speaker, as the Minister briefly explained, that there are a few changes to the Act that are important, and I just wanted to reiterate to the people and to the impacted community. There's a lot of folks that are really interested in how law is administered in the province of Saskatchewan. So they also know that the role of the Justice of the Peace is very straightforward. They're not, as you would consider from the lay perspective, a fully fledged judge, so to speak. They are a tier below, Mr. Speaker, in which sometimes they will sign warrants. On occasion, in some of the northern communities, the Justice of the Peace can postpone a court appearance. They may act as someone that could postpone an entire court proceeding based on challenges of having the circuit court or circuit judge come to some of these northern communities. As an example I would use is, say, bad weather in the middle of winter, where we've seen Justice of the Peace fulfilled some very important roles within the justice system itself. The bill itself includes all Justice of the Peace in the Public Employees Pension Plan, Mr. Speaker, and that's something that we think is really important from the opposition perspective, that in order for us to ensure that the justice system is separated from the legislative system, as is obvious in today's governance practice throughout the country, that it's important that we afford them as much independence as possible and as many benefits as possible, Mr. Speaker. So I think having them the option of joining the PEP plan, Mr. Speaker, is something that's really important, I think, to their to their ability to continue working, but more so, Mr. Speaker, to their ability to being independent within a very independent justice system. The bill also touches briefly on housekeeping amendments. It outlines the benefits to which Justices of the Peace are entitled, and it confirms the validity of pension plan payments under the previous Act following the amendments of the Justice of the Peace Act. So, Mr. Speaker, as I've indicated time and time again, that we would encourage people that have any issues as it pertains to this particular bill, this act, as there's language in every bill that is important. But at the outset, the intent here is to allow the Justice of the Peace to be part of the PEP program. There are a few other administrative and housekeeping amendments that are attached to this particular bill. We will pay attention to those bills, and as I've indicated again time and time over the last number of years, that we have more informed members of our caucus that have served as lawyers in various capacities. They would certainly, they'll certainly have a look at the act itself and see how it complements, which I think it will, if you engage the Justice of the Peace and treat them fairly, and so they're independent, how this affects their role. But, Mr. Speaker, it's clear that they would have more input and more background and history attached to this because of their profession. But it would open up to all the other people out there in Saskatchewan land that might be certainly interested in watching what this bill does and how it affects the Justice of the Peace and so on and so forth. So it's really important that we look through the bill, try to understand it, have very learned people look at overall after certainly lay people like myself have completed their comments. And then, Mr. Speaker, you can certainly see what the bill is all about. And again, we open the comments to this bill to the general public overall. So on that note, it's our first opportunity to see the bill. We will research it, we will study it, we will network, and to see if its desired effect, as indicated by the minister, is achieved. And this part is the role of the official opposition. We're very pleased to be part of that process. So on that note, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 168, the Justice of the Peace Amendment Act 2019.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
2, Bill number 69, the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency Act. Honourable Mr. Caden.
I recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at the end of my remarks today, I'll move the second reading of Bill number 169, the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency Act. Mr. Speaker, Bill 169 proposes legislation to expand the mandate of the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency. Saskatchewan has experienced an increase in the number and severity of disasters within the province over the past 10 years. Many of these events cross municipal and First Nations communities. They require a broad array of provincial resources and coordination to maintain public safety. Today, the majority of this support is provided by two primary areas within government: the Ministry of Environment's Wildfire Management Branch and the Ministry of Government Relations, Emergency Management and Fire Safety Branch. The public, stakeholders and public safety partners are often confused by the distinction between these two provincial agencies with public safety mandates and support services. Better coordination of these services is possible by combining both operational areas into a single, seamless response organization. That is what we are proposing here today, to expand the mandate of the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency, the SPSA, to include delivery of all programs and services currently provided by Wildfire Management and Emergency Management and Fire Safety. When we created the SPSA in 2017 to oversee emergency communications, including our SAS 911 program, we envisioned the benefits of a more robust agency with the tools and operational flexibility to respond to any emergency. The SPSA will provide the foundation for this expanded mandate to ensure government continues to deliver these vital public safety services in a more harmonized manner. For the most part, the public is unaware that emergency and wildfire services are currently being provided by two distinct ministries. Wildfire Management provides wildfire prevention, detection, control, preparedness, suppression, investigation, research, training, education, and reclamation everywhere in Saskatchewan. Emergency Management and Fire Safety provides various emergency and fire response services for any form of hazard or disaster. This includes responding directly to events such as floods, grass fires, and winter storms, while providing community support for incidents such as train derailments, oil spills, and tragedies like the school shooting in La Loche and the Humboldt Broncos bus crash. These services are offered to communities upon request or when local authorities are unable to respond. These two government programs have tended to work separately and on distinct pieces of the same emergency. For example, in 2015, when the province fought forest fires threatening northern communities, we had to evacuate numerous northern communities. We witnessed these two parts of government provide exceptional public safety services. We completed the largest evacuation in the province's history, and we were able to minimize the number of properties and people impacted by wildfire. Both of these government branches, as well as the many volunteers and other public safety response agencies from across Saskatchewan, should be commended for their efforts. However, when we returned the following year to ask the affected communities and others involved in the 2015 response about what went right and what went wrong, we heard a consistent theme in their feedback. We heard that improvements could be made by simply improving how these two provincial entities worked with each other. We also heard that a single point of contact for information would provide more reliable and consistent messaging. We heard that operating under a single banner would provide a more streamlined and consistent approach to emergency response and wildfire management. Constantly improving how we deliver services is of critical importance to our government. Improving how we deliver public safety services in Saskatchewan will benefit everyone working, living, visiting, and investing in our province. Disasters, both natural or human caused, can happen without warning. Every year we face risks from flooding and fires, in addition to sudden tragedies, and the province must be prepared to help. Whether to assist first responders and communities or lead the response itself, these services are vital to safeguard those in jeopardy. If we can improve on how we deliver these services, even incrementally, it will significantly improve the safety of people across this province. Mr. Speaker, we know the climate is changing. Multiple reports and studies have pointed to increasing variability in our weather patterns. This means we can expect more extremes. More extreme hot and cold. More extreme drought and precipitation. These extremes are what keep me up at night. They cannot be accurately predicted, and they cannot be stopped. They come on suddenly, cause untold damage, and threaten our citizens, our property, our infrastructure, and our environment. And while we cannot prevent disasters from happening, we can better prepare our communities and ourselves for extreme events. We can provide the people of this province with the tools to mitigate against the terrible impacts a disaster can have. By expanding the mandate of the SPSA to provide both wildfire and emergency management services, we take another step toward readying ourselves to cope with those unpredictable and often devastating disasters. Expanding the SPSA and bringing together two distinct government entities means public safety decision makers are working as one team with a single mandate. It ensures that one message is delivered to the public and ensures that we can respond more effectively and consistently when disaster strikes. Why does this government require that this bill be passed into legislation during this session? There are two vital reasons. Mr. Speaker, we know we can improve the way we deliver vital public safety services, and the public has echoed this point since at least 2015. The sooner we're able to move forward with this legislation, the sooner we can make real progress on improving the way we deliver our public safety services. Over the course of the 2016-17 and 2017-18 fiscal years, ministerial officials reviewed how public safety services are now structured and on how they could be improved. We found that government is just not structured in a way that is sufficiently flexible and responsive to the public's needs. This is particularly the case when we look at the issue of communications. In our deliberations over creating the agency, we also took into account that only the Yukon Territory provides public safety services in this way. This puts Saskatchewan once again at the forefront of offering innovative ways of delivering public sector services. To that end, Mr. Speaker, Bill 169 proposes that the agency continue to have a high degree of ministerial oversight. Through the governance of a Treasury Board Crown Corporation, we will maintain public accountability for government services. The SPSA Board currently consists of the Honourable Dustin Duncan, Minister of Environment, the Honourable Jim Ryder, Minister of Health, the Honourable Paul Merriman, Minister of Social Services, and myself. As a board, we will continue to oversee this expansion and ensure that the SPSA remains accountable to the people of the province. Mr. Speaker, I wish to repeat that the SPSA has ministerial oversight to ensure the maintenance of public safety and remain accountable to the people of Saskatchewan. Through the proposed legislation, the SPSA will have the power to administer and enforce the Wildfire Act, the Emergency 911 System Act, the Emergency Planning Act, and the Fire Safety Act. The The SPSA will continue providing training programs and other initiatives to ensure the people and communities we serve are ready and able to assist us. In fact, that is the stated purpose of the SPSA, to provide or support public safety services for and with the people, municipalities, Indigenous peoples, public safety service providers, and the Government of Saskatchewan. Why provide or support services for and with the people of Saskatchewan? Because public safety is everyone's responsibility. No one agency, ministry, or level of government can ensure the complete safety of everyone. Every person is responsible for public safety, and every community is responsible to help their residents during emergencies. We are in this together, and the SPSA is created to provide services for and work with the people and communities of Saskatchewan. Everyone is responsible for public safety. Mr. Speaker, the staff providing this support to Saskatchewan people and communities will remain public sector employees. This restructuring is not a cost reduction exercise. Our priority is to enhance the emergency services we provide for the people of Saskatchewan. In accordance with the Saskatchewan Employment Act, unionized employees will transfer to the agency with the same terms and conditions of the current collective bargaining agreement. I am confident the legislative proposal that I have before you today represents the fulfillment of multiple commitments by this government. It is a commitment that public safety risks are understood and will be properly managed and minimized. And it is a commitment the government will continue to support public safety across our province. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I move that the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency Act be read a second time. Thank you.
It's been moved that Bill number 169 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question? Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to again offer the comments on Bill 169 as we hear what the Minister has or is attempting to do with the particular bill as it pertains to public safety. And Mr. Speaker, as we all know, the bill expands, as the Minister explained, the mandate of the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency through this Act to make sure that there are provision for public safety services which would now are inclusive of wildfire management, fire safety services, and emergency management. Now, Mr. Speaker, we often hear of some of the challenges in Saskatchewan as it pertains to public safety. The bill that the Minister introduced today basically finds ways in which it will improve service delivery, to better support communities that are in emergencies, and there's some consequential amendments pursuant to the establishment of this Act that covers and rounds about the entire bill. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is the important point that I would raise, that as we undertake the effort to modernize, as we undertake the effort to rationalize, and as we undertake the effort to do the economies of scale in all of our efforts to help mitigate and prepare for issues that challenge our public safety here in the province of Saskatchewan, the fundamental question that we often ask is, what consultations were done? As we all know from in the northern Saskatchewan perspective, as that's where I live and breathe, Mr. Speaker, there are many, many occasions where wildfires threaten a community, and evacuation is obviously one of the choices and one of the efforts that are being prepared for as it pertains to public safety. Now, in northern Saskatchewan, we have been subjected over the years to wildfire threats to our community, and in particular the far northern communities, the Athabasca Basin communities, but other communities are not immune to it as well, Mr. Speaker. So as you hear of some of the challenges that as it pertains to emergencies, there is a real connect that we have, Mr. Speaker, as northern people as it pertains to wildfire. And so you begin to really pay attention to what is being proposed in the bill, and certainly you always make sure that you have the valued advice of many, many leaders in northern Saskatchewan, many leading organizations as well. And I would suggest organizations like the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, the FSIN, Mr. Speaker, New North, Meadow Lake Travel Council, the Prince Albert Grand Council, each mayor and each chief of the impacted communities. It is hoped, Mr. Speaker, that they are the first point of contact for seeking advice on how best to build this model that integrates all the government's effort in dealing with public safety threats. So I think it's important that the first message we have from the official opposition is consult, 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 consult. And we've seen the improper damage that's being created when you don't consult. When you make a move and you make an effort to undertake certain things, and I'll use the reference to the recent SGI accreditation process for doing all the repairs. Well, the minister mentioned that they're going to do all these changes when it came to SGI. And Mr. Speaker, he received a firestorm of protests from smaller operators in smaller rural communities that said, don't be changing how we work with SGI because that'll cost us a lot of business. Now we're saying the minister is backtracking, and backtracking badly, because he did one thing wrong. He didn't consult. And he put these changes in place, Mr. Speaker, and I'm certain that SGI heard of it, but I'm more certain that the minister's office got a number of calls, as other MLAs did, and that's what happens when you do not consult. So on bills that are important, Mr. Speaker, on things and changes on SGI, it was the opposition, my colleague from Prince Albert, that brought up the issue, and basically scolded the minister, saying you made these changes without consulting with the SGI repairs out in rural Saskatchewan. And guess what, Mr. Speaker? The minister had to backtrack, and backtrack fast, because the people weren't going to stand for it. And that's the problem you have when you do not consult. So as the minister undertakes an even more pressing matter with deals with public safety, we reiterate our point. Please consult with the leadership, and please consult with the people that are doing the actual service, Mr. Speaker. My colleague and I, the member from Cumberland, had the opportunity to tour a few evacuation sites where people were living. And Mr. Speaker, make no mistake about it, the people in Red Cross, the people that volunteer, the different organizations that volunteer, they provide a valuable service. As we visited some of the evacuation sites, they were certainly people working very hard. And we commend them, and we always encourage them, because it's a heavy responsibility to make sure every child, every parent, every grandparent is taken care of, Mr. Speaker, and that's a tremendous undertaking. But let us not forget the toll on those that are being evacuated as well, Mr. Speaker. So the consultation process must involve the leadership, the service delivery agencies that are involved, whether it's Red Cross or whether it's a First Nations organization. They should be consulted as well on the changes being proposed. And Mr. Speaker, finally, the people that are impacted by some of the public safety challenges, be it wildfire in the north, where they're forced to evacuate from their home, they should also be engaged in the consultation process to say, how could we build this better? So there's a number of factors that we must incorporate in our approach to making sure this bill meets the target, Mr. Speaker. I was pleased to hear the minister say that this effort is designed to enhance, not cost save, which a lot of us would consider as some job losses as they amalgamate these efforts. So, Mr. Speaker, the minister was clear today that there will be no such job losses, and that's one of the things that we want to make sure happens, because at the moment the government talks about consolidation of services and coordination of services, to many people that's a buzzword for job losses, and the minister said today that that's not the case in this particular bill, because what you don't want to do is lessen nor water down the ability for people to help those that are being impacted by the public safety challenges we sometimes face. So this is really something that we have to pay attention to, Mr. Speaker. If you're going to do something as significant as this, you have to do it correctly, with great consultation, and without the underlying theme of saving money and cutting jobs. Finally, Mr. Speaker, it is hoped that no community in the province of Saskatchewan have to go through these particular challenges, but we must prepare, we must be ready, and we certainly must have the proper resources to do an effective job. So it is important to note that how does this overall affect the budget for this year? These are some of the critical questions we have on this particular bill. More consultation from our end will take place. We invite the public in general to come and consult and advise us as well. But, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of work to do on this bill. Other colleagues of mine will have the opportunity to provide their input as well, which is a highly valuable exercise from our perspective. We do want to keep this government accountable. We want to hold them accountable, Mr. Speaker, and bills of this sort, of this effort, need our full attention, and we're certainly going to provide that attention, Mr. Speaker. So on that note, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 169, the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency Act.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second readings, item number 3, Bill number 170, the Mineral Taxation Amendment Act 2019. The Honourable Ms. Eyre.
I recognize the Minister of Energy and Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise today to move second reading of the Mineral Taxation Amendment Act 2019. This act would amend the Mineral Taxation Act 1983 regarding uncertified mineral titles, titles that are defined in the Land Titles Act of 2000. These are mines and minerals for which no mineral certificate was issued and ownership has not been determined or certified by the Registrar of Titles. These retroactive amendments confirm the Crown's authority to collect the mineral rights tax on uncertified mineral titles. The Mineral Taxation Act 1983 levies the mineral rights tax on roughly 40,000 freehold mineral titles in the province of Saskatchewan. Approximately 17,600 of these freehold mineral titles, or about 44%, are uncertified. Mr. Speaker, these mineral rights taxpayers are primarily a mix of Saskatchewan and Alberta corporations. Saskatchewan-based corporations comprise 16% or so of the total revenue and represent about 64% of all mineral rights taxpayers, just over 1,000 corporations. Alberta-based corporations contribute 79% of the total mineral rights tax revenue. They account for about 19% of all mineral rights taxpayers, comprising some 305 corporations. Saskatchewan derives about 71% of its mineral rights tax revenue from primarily Alberta-based corporations that own the majority of the freehold mineral rights in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan is a mining jurisdiction that is already a world leader in many respects and very well positioned for growth. The estimated value of our mineral sales last year was approximately $7 billion. Over 30,000 people in Saskatchewan owe their livelihoods to this industry in some way. Many businesses and communities across the province stand on the shoulders of this dynamic industry as a result of the type of sustained investment activity that we see here. We have no doubt our mineral resources sector will continue to be a major contributor to our economic growth. Mr. Speaker, I now move second reading of the Mineral Taxation Amendment Act 2019.
It has been moved that Bill number 170 be now read a second time. Is the assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Bill 171, the Mineral Taxation Amendment Act 2019, Mr. Speaker, is really an important act that a lot of people in Saskatchewan need to pay attention to, Mr. Speaker, because obviously, from our perspective, developing our natural resources in the province of Saskatchewan is very, very important, because obviously the base of all the minerals and the base of all the resources that we enjoy here in Saskatchewan must be certainly developed to a point where it creates a great opportunity for people to work, an investment opportunity for the companies that wish to use the resource for their purposes, Mr. Speaker, and of course to ensure that Saskatchewan has the adequate income tax base to sustain all the services that the people of Saskatchewan come to expect. So it's really important, Mr. Speaker, to look at these three tranches of thought as we look at any bill that the government brings forward when it involves any of our resource base here in the province of Saskatchewan. On this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, we have to be very, very careful as to how we undertake the research on this bill and what the government's intent behind the bill itself is all about. So, Mr. Speaker, the bill itself expands the definition of mineral commodity by including minerals pertaining to uncertified mineral titles. Now, what is primarily meant by uncertified mineral titles, Mr. Speaker? Who is impacted by this legislation? And certainly, what minerals in general are we discussing overall as it pertains to some of these titles. It certainly asserts the Crown's authority to collect mineral rights tax on some of these uncertified mineral titles. And it also adds a clause, Mr. Speaker, to protect the Crown and personnel of the Crown from any potential legal actions based on any claims for loss or damages resulting from this act. So, Mr. Speaker, we have to be very careful as we look at what the bill itself intends to do. A lot of folks may not know the legalities behind some of these acts, and certainly look at the difference between an uncertified mineral title versus a certified mineral title. We need to know all those nuances of what is being intended on this, what the intention behind this bill is all about. And that's one of the reasons, Mr. Speaker, that from our perspective, from the official opposition perspective, that we, again, as we've said time and time again, reiterate and emphasize consultation with the different industries that are working in this sector, Mr. Speaker. That consultation phase must be undertaken because obviously, as I said at the outset, it is important that we, A, appreciate what Saskatchewan has to offer, B, that we utilize as best we can the benefits we have of living in this province to ensure that people are working, companies are getting a return on their investment for some of the work and effort they put into developing a resource, and of course see that Saskatchewan as a province certainly benefits from some of the royalty regimes and opportunities attached to developing some of the resources so that we can again provide services that the people of Saskatchewan expect. So it is a very important balance to achieve, Mr. Speaker, and part of the biggest opportunity the government has to achieve those balances is to consult, Mr. Speaker, and ask for advice, because I'm telling you, when we're subjected to some of the industrial points over time, over the past number of years, I've enjoyed being an MLA. I can tell you that some of the most sage advice we get is from the people that we're trying to help, Mr. Speaker, and some of the industry people that are out there. They have a tremendous amount of experience, a tremendous amount of research and data. They have a tremendous amount of intelligence on some of these things. So that's the reason why it's important for governments to consult. So on that note, we intend to do that. We're going to network. We're going to open up the lines of communication so folks can know exactly what is being done here, and if they have any concerns, we will certainly do our job as the official opposition to hold this government to account. We intend to do that, Mr. Speaker, and we intend to do that throughout the entire process as this bill moves through the Legislative Assembly process. So on that note, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 171, the Mineral Taxation Amendment Act 2019.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure of Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourned debates. Item number 3, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 165, the Workers' Compensation Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Sark.
Recognize a member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My remarks in this circumstance will be brief, but it is good to take my place and offer a few observations around Bill number 165, the Workers' Compensation Amendment Act 2018. I am the only thing that stands in the way between this bill getting to committee. So again, there's some good things in this bill. There's some things that resemble recommendations that ushered forward from the 2016 Committee of Review. It was a multi-party arrangement, Mr. Speaker, that brings together labor and the employers to look at the Workers' Compensation Board's performance and to provide recommendations on how that might be improved. Also, Mr. Speaker, as sort of a later add-in to this bill, and again, we appreciated the government giving us as much advance notice of these measures as was possible, but certainly the expansion of the number of cancers upon which presumptive coverage is extended under the Workers' Compensation Act. Again, Mr. Speaker, really good to see. We'd certainly extend our congratulations and thanks in this juncture to the good folks of the International Association of Firefighters here in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, and the tremendous work of advocacy and lobbying that they engage in, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that their members have some of the best coverage on offer in the entirety of Canada, Mr. Speaker. So there are a number of good things in this bill. There are some things that are in line with the Committee of Review. There are some measures in the bill as regards to reporting period is one in particular, Mr. Speaker, the time at which the response is to be made to the Committee of Review, that we'll be looking for all further comment from the government for the clarification in terms of the measures contained herein, Mr. Speaker, as they do not usher forward from the Committee of Review process. So, Mr. Speaker, part of our demur in providing expedited passage for this legislation back in the fall was so that this could be squarely in the eye of those who all have an interest in this legislation, Mr. Speaker, and indeed have made different contributions to the legislation as it sits before us today and through processes like the Committee of Review. So, Mr. Speaker, in interest of providing that greater comment period, Mr. Speaker, we took a pass on expedited passage of this legislation, but certainly, Mr. Speaker, we hope that the time that has accrued in the interim has not just been of value for greater reflection, greater contemplation of these measures, Mr. Speaker, but also that that will not have in any way interfered with the good application of the expansion of the presumptive cancers that are further enumerated in this legislation. And again, Mr. Speaker, we were provided with relative assurance that more time to the passage of the bill would not impede that in any way, shape, or form. So, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the committee process and having that more detailed discussion at that stage of the legislative process affords. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd move to take my place and urge the Government House Leader to do what need be done to move this bill on to the committee stage of the process.
Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 165 be now read a second time. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? I recognize Government House Leader.
I designate the Bill 165, the Workers' Compensation Amendment Act 2018, be committed to the Standing Committee on Human Services.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Human Services.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 160, the Trespass to Property Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Saar.
I recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To join in on Bill 160, the Trespass Property Amendment Act 2018. I know my colleagues have spent quite a length on some of them, and I think the member from Athabasca has shared quite his experience and talked about his own family's experience, and talked about his father and the fight that his father did, and then I give him credit for his passion he spoke of about the trespass law that's being brought forward and his concerns. And Mr. Speaker, I guess there was an issue, and I don't know, from what I'm hearing, it would have been about crime to rural property, but we know crime's up everywhere. But at the end of the day, my understanding, this was to deal with, government came with legislation that wanted to address rural crime, and if that's my understanding, that's what they figured this legislation would come forward would solve or lessen, I guess, crime. And I know we're going to have lots to say in committee. We're going to get a good opportunity. When I think about most times when you have an issue that's facing our province or facing the province of Saskatchewan, I know members on this side and governments, most governments, unfortunately the Sask Party government doesn't seem to think they have to do this. It's called consult, talk with residents, those people that are going to be impacted, those residents that are struggling. You talk with everyone. Will this process affect Métis rights, First Nation rights, any rights of citizens, any rights of users that use the land? And in this case, I think this government has unfortunately could have gone forward, done some great work with consulting, talking with all the partners, First Nations, Métis, Wildlife Federation. The list goes on of people they could have, municipalities. I mean, the list goes on where you could have had a good opportunity to have a good dialogue and find out how do we solve these problems. Talk to First Nations, Métis. There was a good opportunity, and the government could have done this in a way that felt that people's rights were not in question here when it comes to their right to hunt, fish, gather, trap. And I think that's so important. When you have First Nations coming out and like FSIN has come out and, you know, with their feeling of how this was done, and you know, I'm not going to speak for them, but, you know, there's article after article and you know, they're talking and they're going to raise their concern, and they have to different members, and I'm hopefully members on that side of the House have heard the issues. But having said that, Mr. Speaker, it could have been a situation where we come together and we work together as a society, as a communities, and our province has always been very good at working together. Whether when we talk about, we give praise about those that volunteer, the list goes on. But I just know that my colleague talked a number of times on second reading to bills today from Athabasca. And again, in many of his talks that he talked about to consult. It's important to consult with those that are impacted, First Nations, Métis, consult with our residents. But this government has such a lack of talking with Saskatchewan people, those that are impacted. They just make things and they reverse, and we see how that's what happens. When a government doesn't get it right, they have to reverse. And we've seen time and time again where this government just goes out and does something and then realizes they got to come back and, you know, they've made a mistake. Well, if they would consult with the people that they're impacting, they would find out that they wouldn't have to reverse it, because that's how you do it. You consult with people and then you make a plan. That's how it's supposed to work. But unfortunately, they have an idea of the way they want it, and it doesn't matter about who they consult, who they talk to then. So having said that, I know with Bill 160, and I think, you know, and I would not speak for any Métis First Nations, but I think what I'm hearing is people are not happy, and there may be a challenge. I'm not sure if they're going to, but there could be a court challenge on this actual bill, trespassing. And I guess it's, whether it's the Wildlife Federation, from what I've got from my colleagues talking, and I think I look at Hansard, some of the comments, a lot of organizations, good organizations that do good work and are trying to follow the laws and do the right things, were not consulted in this area. So having said that, it's unfortunate, but I know at the end of the day, this government will have to answer to it, and I wish, you know, Métis Nation, FSIN, those organizations that were impacted want to challenge this, and I think they have a right to. As citizens, when we feel that we have not been treated right by a government, and you know, you have the courts to use, and hopefully the courts will look at this if someone should launch a complaint or launch where this is going to go before the courts, a challenge to the Trespassing Act. We'll see what happens. But having said that, I know my colleagues, and many of them have spoke to this and have shared some pretty good knowledge of it. And again, I know we'll go in committee, we're going to have some questions, and the government of the day will hopefully, and minister, the officials can explain in committee how this came about and why they didn't do the proper consultation that they should have done to many people that weren't impacted and weren't talked to and shared with. So having said that, I don't have any more comments, Mr. Speaker, on this bill. We'll wait till it goes to committee. I know my colleagues, we will have many more questions. We're going to talk with those that were, have been impacted and don't feel that this change was the right way, that they were consulted. We'll bring their issues and their questions forward to the Minister and Ministry. So at this point, I'm prepared to adjourn debate on 160, the Trespass Property Amendment Act 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 2, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 161, the Trespass to Property Consequential Amendments Act 2018. Ms. Saar.
I recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To join in on Bill 161, the Trespass to Property Consequential Amendments Act 2018. Here, of course, because we have the change in legislation that's coming forward, there's a small change in here, and I know we'll ask them questions. And my understanding of it is what's going to happen now is before you used to have a sign, do not hunt, and if somebody went on that property and hunt, there would be a consequence, a fine for doing that, not following. Now what the consequential amendments are doing in here is, from my understanding, it will now be on private land. You will have to now get land from any land that's privately owned, from the owner or somebody who is residing on that property. You will have to get permission from them before you can just go on a hunt. Even if it's not posted, you thought that there was nobody there, you no longer, from my understanding, if it's private land, you will have to get consent of the owners. So if you don't, you then will be fined. So it changes into the Wildlife Act, is, from my understanding, that's what the consequential amendments are. You will be, you will not, if you don't get consent and permission of the owner, you will have a fine, and that's what this provision in there. So as I said, we'll have more questions in committee for the Minister and officials, and again, see where we go with this. But at this time, I have no further comments on Bill 161. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. Recognize Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move this House do not adjourn so we can go work, so the committees can do their good work today.
It has been moved by the Government House Leader that the Assembly now adjourn. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. This Assembly stands adjourned until tomorrow at 1:30 p.m. Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's such a pleasure to be here in the legislature today for question period and to be joined by so many people from the CTS